And welcome back. In the previous video, we implemented source address translation, specifically with overloading of one or two addresses, which means it's PAT, and it was also done with a dynamic configuration, meaning the actual translations aren't built and set up until there's actually traffic showing up that needs to be routed that matches the conditions for the address translation. Now, in this video, we're going to implement the same exact results, except instead of implementing the address translation on a security policy by security policy entry, instead, we're going to use central source NAT, and I'll walk you through that right now. So back at firewall 1, let's go back to our policy and objects and go to our firewall policy, and it was here that we implemented the address translation. So let's go ahead and modify that security policy, and then I'm going to specify down here that instead of using the dynamic pool, I'll get rid of that. I'll just say go ahead and use the outgoing interface. And furthermore, we could also say, please don't do NAT in the security policy rule. However, what I'm about to show you will negate the need for clicking this button, because we're going to tell the system, the firewall with this virtual domain, we're going to tell it that the whole system should use centralized NAT as opposed to the NAT that's implemented on a security policy entry by security policy entry method. So I'm going to click OK here. Now let me share with you where we would go to implement centralized network address translation, and that is down here under System. So we'll click on System over here on the left, and then we'll go to Settings. So under System, under Settings, we're going to scroll down, and it's going to specify what type of firewall do you want me to be. The NGFW, Next Generation Firewall Mode, profile-based or policy-based. We're going to leave it at profile-based for now, but we're going to go ahead and specify that we want to use centralized NAT and leave it at profile-based. As we get into our further videos, we will eventually go to policy-based as well. And when we click on policy-based, the only method that we're going to implement NAT with policy-based is using centralized NAT. So for now, let's go ahead and just use profile-based with centralized SNAT for source NAT and click on Apply. Now to verify that that took, I'm going to go ahead and go off of that for a moment and come back, go down to Settings, scroll down. Another way of verifying that we are using centralized configuration for NAT as opposed to policy rule by policy rule is to go up here to Policy and Objects. And if we see under Policy and Objects, Central SNAT, that means that this is using centralized NAT. If we were set up for no centralized NAT, this central NAT option would not appear here under Policies and Objects. So let's go back to our firewall policy and just verify that this is no longer where we are going to configure address translation. So here's our rule, inside to outside. I'll go ahead and double click on it to bring it up. And so traffic coming in on port 2, this being routed out port 4. If the source is 10 anything and the destination is any IP address and it's any service, we're going to allow it to go through and check it out. Under firewall/network options, there's no longer an option here to specify NAT or PAT or the pool or anything else because we're using centralized NAT. So how do we set up centralized NAT? The answer is under Policies and Objects, we'd go down to Central SNAT for source address translation. At the moment, there are no rules for source address translation, so let's go ahead and create one. We'll click on Create New, and we'll specify traffic coming in from the inside if that traffic is being routed out the outside, and if the source address is 10 anything, and if the destination address is anything, then how do we want that to be configured? So we could have like 15 or 16 or 25 entries as far as security policies, and none of them are going to have the address translation rules in them. Instead, the source address translation rules are configured right here. So here we can specify that we want to use NAT, and we could use the outgoing interface, whatever the IP address is on the egress or port 4 interface, we could use that, or we could use a dynamic pool. So we click here for dynamic pool and click on the plus symbol. Now we have this pool that already points to 208 and 209. It also specifies that pool is an overload type, so it's going to be using PAT. So if we wanted to, we could just use that pool one more time. It's the same pool. So let's go ahead and choose that pool. Then we can get very specific about when we want this address translation to happen. For any protocol, or just for TCP, or just for UDP. Do we want to have explicit port mappings involved? So I'm going to go ahead and say for any traffic. And in fact, just for grins and help confirm that we aren't looking at any old translations, let's do this. For the actual pool, let me go ahead and edit that. And let's make it 23.1.2.111 through 23.1.2.112. So that way we still have a couple IP addresses to play with, but it still is going to be doing PAT because we're overloading on those two addresses. So we could have thousands of devices that are all going to end up being mapped to one of those two addresses as our source addresses are being translated as the traffic is being routed out. So we'll click on OK and click on OK. So from the CLI at the firewall, let's do this as well. Let's go ahead and clear all of our existing sessions. So to do that, we can type in diagnose, sys, session, and then the word clear. So effectively that cleared all of our sessions, including this SSH session I just had. And let's do a get system session list. So with all the sessions wiped out, let's go back to our 3 machines. I'll generate some traffic and then we'll come back and take a look at our session list. So I'm on the Windows computer, I'll hit refresh there. I'm on the Linux machine, I'll hit refresh there. And on our 3rd machine, I'll refresh that as well. All right, so let's take a look at the sessions and the translations. So we'll do a get system session and list and press enter. And let me scroll up so we can see the column headers once again. So for our devices, we've got 152 and we've got 161 right there. And I don't see 254. We may have to scroll down for that. So let me go ahead and run that command again and go down further. All right, here we have examples of all of them. So there's 161, there's 152, and there's 254 right there. So these 3 entries represent the source IP addresses of the 3 devices in our topology. And as far as mapping goes, it chose to map 161 to 112, it mapped 152 to 111, and also 254 to 111. And the biggest difference here with centralized source NAT is that we didn't include the network address translation or port address translation information in the security policy entries. Instead, we came over to central NAT, and that's where we set up the rules regarding source address translation for these devices. Now, what if we have devices that don't want to share, or we have specific needs where we don't want to do overloading of many IP addresses to one? Instead of using port address translation, if we have enough IP addresses on the outside to go around, we can do a one-to-one mapping, and that's called network address translation, and that's what we're going to cover in the next video, so I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.